Good morning. Shalom Aleichem. And welcome to 10 Minutes of Torah. We've been talking about Pharaoh and the Jewish people. And over the past few days, we've had the opportunity to discuss the complicated scenario of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. It seems wrong. It's like just wrong. Is there free choice or not? Who's calling the shots? And so if you read the text that describes God's hardening of the heart, you can use that as a springboard to imagine multiple ways of seeing that. Bo'el Paro, God says to Moses last week, go speak to him. And then the next few words are kind of like counterintuitive. Ki ani hichbadati es leiv paro, es libo. I go and talk to him because I have hardened his heart. Now, it would seem very elegant and neat and predictable if the text were to say, go to Pharaoh. It's a great time now because I've softened his heart.
Right.
Why are you going to him when I've hardened his heart? That should be a reason to stay away for a while. You know, when a person is angry, it's usually the worst time to engage or re-engage with the person because you're not really talking to the person, you're talking to the person's anger. And that's like throwing logs on a fire. In the case of the fire, it's a good thing because it warms you. In the case of the anger, throwing logs on that fire burns you. And so, stay away. And yet, it seemingly built into the nature of the mission, the intentionality of his refusal, of the inevitability of Moses' failure to convince Pharaoh is part of the structure of the redemption, the Exodus picture. God wants him to be stubborn so as to maximize the massive upheaval of the Exodus, despite Pharaoh's refusal. So it's a demonstration of power, of might, of ultimate authority. It's a re-shifting of the balance of power away from Pharaoh and back into the hands of the outstretched arm of Zroa and Atuya, all the different ways of describing that superior strength. Shock and awe. And so, that's one way of looking at it. But it seems like there has to be a Kabbalah, a deeper mystical, more Zen way of seeing this that doesn't have God overplaying his role. Because what happens when God overplays his role, he minimizes the relevance and the significance of our agency. And so we have to take this interaction between God and Moses and kind of highlight it and cut and paste it into the context of our own dynamics. And so that interaction is a universal dynamic. The Pharaoh, the Moses, the slavery, we can imagine all that as encompassing the dynamics of our personal struggles. And so in that scenario, in the personalizing of this story, there's a rereading of the text to suggest something entirely different. Ki ani hichbadati eslev paro. Who hardens whose heart? Who has the keys to the heart of man? He has the master key. But who holds the strings in the hardening of or softening of one's own heart is oneself. Right. In fact, one of the best known descriptions about the divine providence, and obviously one that is theologically complex, is Hakol bidei shamayim. Everything is in the hands of God, chutz miyirat shamayim, except for the fear of God, the fear of heaven. Mm-hmm. So the flourishing or the depleting of the human reservoir, the emotional reservoir, is the one thing that's not in God's hands. Mm. So seeing it from that angle, Ani hichbadati eslev paro, we are Pharaoh, and ani actually means I as in myself, and you, us. We are responsible for the hardening or softening of our own hearts. And so when God says to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart, it's really a conversation that we are having at the place of our significant traumas, our slaveries, our personal enslavements, the places that hold us, the places we have positioned ourselves to be our own hostages, or someone else's hostage, or the hostage to an idea, the hostage to an emotion, a negative, an unhealthy emotion, the hostage to circumstantial realities in our lives that have gotten the better of us. And so we stand here poised in a very emotionally loaded moment. These weeks of slavery and redemption carry a lot of potency, a lot of energy for us to engage in that dynamic and to reimagine the paradigms of our lives and resist the temptation to justify inaction, to justify a passive stance in the face of our most pressing challenges by invoking a past trauma, by invoking our slavery, by invoking that which was done to us, that which enslaved us, as opposed to the places where we and the ways in which we excel at slaving ourselves. enslaving ourselves. And so the question that's being posed is a powerful existential question. How do we move forward in our lives in the face of adversity? And there are two very general ways of reacting. One is, I don't have the stamina and the motivation or the self-worth to move forward beyond that which was done to me. I accept the terms of my enslavement. I enact the most ancient of unhealthy enactments, the capitulation of one's sense of self to a factor outside of oneself is the oldest form of terrorism, and the slave, the one who has forfeited his or her sense of self, outsourced it, is the ultimate hostage. And so we can say, I don't have to go out of Egypt. I don't have to let myself out of my Egypt, because my heart is heartened. My heart is heartened by what was perpetuated at my cost.
It's so easy.
And it's
very easy.
It's convenient. It was my childhood. Had I only had X, Y, and Z, things would have been different for me. Had I only bought that building, everyone always knows a building that they could have bought for 50 cents.
Jackie Mason.
Yeah. And had I only, if only are the two most toxic, poisonous words that essentially accept that the hardening of one's heart has been taken out of one's own hand. And it's God that hardens the heart of Pharaoh, the ultimate ani. But the ani that means each and every one of us is a legitimate ani in the Torah. And the question we ask ourselves this week and next week is, are we prepared to see ourselves as the architects of our own moral and spiritual destinies? And it was Moses who had to have the imagination to be able to redraw the lines between where we were and where we could be, between who we are now and who we used to be. And it's very fortuitous because tonight is the 10th of Shvat, and it will be 70 years since the Rebbe became Rebbe and assumed the mantle of leadership from the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. And so it's a momentous day. 70 is a very significant number in Judaism. 70 elders, 70 languages, 70 faces of Torah, 70 Jewish holy days, not counting the rabbinically from the Chachamim, including the 52 Shabbats.
Right.
So, and of course, 70 is the number that represents the perfection of the cycle of 7 times 10. 50 is Yovel, Jubilee. right? And then so this is like a jubilee.
Right.
49 is us doing everything we can, and then the 50th is a moment of pure nirvana, of enlightenment, of the reciprocal action that is beyond us. And so the number 70 is very powerful. It's also powerful in the context of leadership, when Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who was a mere stripling of 18 years old, about 18 years old, became the leader of the entire Jewish people. He said, Harei ani keven shivim shana. I see myself, it was a miracle. He went to sleep as an 18-year-old and he woke up looking like a 70-year-old. But apparently the number 70 is the perfect number for leadership. And so 70 years since the Rebbe became Rebbe is a very powerful opportunity to meditate on his leadership, on the central themes that defined his leadership and his legacy. And so I think if you had to sum it up in a nutshell, the encapsulation of everything that the Rebbe envisioned is right here in this same dialectic between God's hardening of the heart and one's hardening of one's own heart. The Rebbe, like Moses standing at the foot of Sinai, was poised between, on one hand, the darkest of the dark night, slavery. In the case of the Rebbe, it was a Jewish people decimated in the aftermath of the Holocaust, of mass genocide that was the result of the hardening of the human heart, not the hardening of the divine heart. And in the light of that, in the aftermath of that, whether on the biblical level or in our own time era, the stage is set, and the backdrop is the darkest side and the deepest heavens. And Moses and the Rebbe, when he assumed this leadership 70 years ago, they were in that place, poised between the blackest earth and the brightest heaven. And so, what do? And it took the moral imagination of Moses to reframe the question for the Jewish people and to ask them. The question that he asked them at Sinai was, are you going to remain addicted to the cycle of your victimhood, in which God hardens your heart? Or are you going to accept a new and revolutionary paradigm that allows you to determine the trajectory of your own life, independent of what others think, of what others do, of what else happened?
Right.
None of that defines you unless you allow it to define you. You hold the keys to your own heart, Moses tells this ragged and broken mass of traumatized and hopeless people. And so he says to them, which version of yourself are you going to function with? What operating system are you going to use? Is it going to be the one that was programmed into you, that came from outside of you? A joy that came from outside of you? A tragic moment that was caused to you? Or are you going to allow yourself to be defined by yourself, by your original being? And it's powerful that the first teaching, the first public teaching that the Rebbe shared was a mimer based on the Song of Songs. And it says, Basi Lagani, I came to my garden. And it's paraphrasing God, a conversation, so to speak, between God and on one hand, and creation, existence on the other. The conversation that keeps happening throughout every stream that runs through every era and every individual. And the beauty of it is that God is coming to this desolation, to this place of desolation. And it doesn't look so pretty. But he sees it not for what was done to it, for how it looks, but he sees it for what it used to be and what it could still be. Basi Lagani, I came to my garden, L'makam shahaya ikr b'tchila, the place, my original place, my original self. The garden that doesn't look like this garden, but that looks like the most beautiful garden. That's here. It used to be nice here before the darkness descended. And I can be in this garden that used to be so beautiful and is now overgrown with weeds and debris. And I can see it for what it used to be, the Garden of Eden. Or I can see it as a mere shadow of its old self and accept and pay and pledge allegiance to that. And the Rebbe said, are you going to come to your garden and see it for what it used to be? And it's an existential question that he asked each and every one of us to ask ourselves, are we going to find the courage and the imagination to see ourselves as we are fundamentally, as we are authentically ourselves, the way we were when light flowed through us before the hordes descended, before everything that happened, and for every one of us it's something different. And if so, then we are accepting the power to soften our own hard places, to go back there. And then he says, and it's kind of poignant in the way that Torah was received was that the Jewish people didn't go up the mountain. Mm-hmm. Doing so would have been a fleeing of the reality of their trauma, of the depth of the actual pain. So they said, no. Moses said, stay here. Don't pretend that you're not in a really horrible place. Mm-hmm. Lean into that and embrace it, but don't embrace it as a victim. Embrace it as a warrior. You bring that Torah down here. This is where I am. This is where I'm at. With my hunchback, with my sadness, with my tears, I can learn to re-celebrate who I used to be. And it's an amazing imagination that says, I can see through the darkness to the light that used to be here, that used to shine here. And I can get past the Sivlot Mitzrayim, the heaviness of Egypt. And I think it's not coincidental that these two energies are circling one another. The notion of finding the lost self was at the center of everything the Rebbe fought for. That also was realistic enough to see reality, but not to flee from it. To accept it on its terms and then recalibrate its operating systems. And bring God down from the mountain to the people, to where they were. And that was the Rebbe said, bring the light into the tachton, into the place that conventionally is the most resistant to light. That's the place where the light was. And so, whatever is ground zero for us in our lives is also the place that leaves us on the threshold of making our biggest choices about who we are and how we move forward. And so, it's only from ground zero that we can reimagine what stood at ground zero, and then from that place, begin to build up again. And drawing the lines of connection between the two requires a Rebbe, requires a Moses, requires a Rabbi Akiva to dance on the ruins. Because that's the doorway. That's the gateway to heaven. Ironically, is the place of the most fiery hell. Yeah. And it takes a Rebbe to point us in the right direction. And so the Rebbe pointed us in that direction. He taught us to be fearless and to resist the intimidation of our shadow selves. And to the contrary, acquaint ourselves with them and see them as the staging ground, not as ground zero, but as staging ground. You can look at it one way, or you could look at it another. It could be the hardening, God hardening the heart, or it could be us softening our own hearts. Yom Tov.
Yom Tov.
Have a great day, everybody.
Isn't there a theme there that we can overrule